Hey everyone, this is HFY Galactic Empire Fall. Stories forged by humans, not machines. Because HFY is our story. I'm Orion Thane. Subscribe and witness what comes next. Mira looked at it for a second before touching anything. The strip hung from the slot in a clean white tongue, one end curled by heat, the printed grid cut off in the middle of a line. The machine made no error sound. It only kept its small internal hum, as if it had finished properly and was waiting for her to move on. She pressed the cancel key with one finger. Nothing changed. Across the room, Soren was on his knees beside the floor panel near Array 3. One sleeve rolled past the wrist, a driver set against the lip of the seam. He did not look up when he said, "Paper jam. It thinks it completed. That's different." Mira pinched the strip and drew it out carefully. The edge was warm. The last printed section ended in a time mark that did not belong to the current run. She read it once, then again, then laid the strip flat beside her keyboard, smoothing it with 2 fingers. Soren loosened the panel screws one by one and arranged them in a line on the floor, each with the same gap between them. The driver clicked softly at each turn. He set the panel aside, leaned in, and studied the fiber bundles under the deck. Mira did not call him over. Not yet. The observation room had been built for long patience. 3 consoles curved around the forward glass. Behind them stood storage drawers, sealed cabinets, a kettle no one used properly, and a narrow shelf where old paper records lived because Mira did not trust every copy to remain digital forever. The room smelled faintly of heated circuits and dry filters. Beyond the glass, the planet's night side was a dark plate veined with weather. Far below, the monitored settlements traced pale geometry along the coastlines. They had been watching the coastal species for 11 months. Watching was the approved word. Not cataloging, not evaluating, not preparing. Watching. The station charter used careful language. No contact without consent. No signal shaping. No atmosphere entry beneath the cloud line. No assumptions about symbolic thought until repeatable evidence crossed all 6 thresholds. By month 4, Mira had stopped reading the charter. By month 6, Soren had memorized it. She fed the strip back into the printer tray and asked for a diagnostic. The screen paused longer than usual before responding. No hardware fault detected. Under the line, the system printed the time. It matched the strip she had just removed. Mira leaned back in her chair and watched the clock in the upper corner tick forward. When it reached the same second again, she said, "Soren." He rose, panel still open at his feet, and crossed the room without hurry. Tall, spare, careful not to brush the edge of any console. He read the screen, then the strip, then checked the printer housing with the back of his knuckles like he was testing a wall for heat. "Cache issue," he said. "Not on an isolated diagnostic printer. Then the timestamp source is wrong. Its station synced." He reached past her, opened the settings pane, and traced the source chain. Local clock, station clock, array clock, external reference, all green, all current, all aligned to within tolerances that normally bored both of them. He tapped the strip once near the cut line. When did it stop? Mid-print. Any sound? No. He nodded and crouched by the printer, taking off the side panel with his thumb and driver, even though the panel had a quick release tab and could have been opened faster another way. Soren distrusted quick solutions in machines designed by committees. Mira watched him lift the roller assembly, inspect the feed path, clear a speck of residue smaller than a nail clipping, and replace everything in the reverse order he had opened it. His hands moved with plain efficiency. No wasted gestures. No irritation. When he finished, he set the screws on the desk pad, each head facing the same direction. She turned the strip toward herself. The wrong timestamp came from 17 minutes in the future. That should have been enough to make it interesting. It was not enough to make it meaningful. On the main screen, the passive surface feed continued its steady sweep across one of the monitored coastal settlements. The species they'd been assigned to study lived in structures grown from layered mineral foam and shoreroot. Their roads shifted with the tides. Their gathering sites moved every few weeks. They left no monuments large enough to be seen from orbit, but they aligned their night lamps with such precision that Mira had spent 2 months proving the patterns were intentional. She enlarged the latest frame. 7 figures stood on a long breakwater that had not been there in last week's survey. They faced inland, not toward the sea. Beside them sat 6 narrow containers in 2 rows. Mira called up previous nights. Same place, same hour, different number of figures, different number of containers. Soren slid the printer panel back into place. Run it again. She did. The strip came through clean this time. No stoppage. Correct timestamp. Full grid. Soren took the first strip from the desk and held it beside the second. Same diagnostic sequence. Same print density. Same alignment. Only the time differed. Could the system have queued an earlier request? He asked. It's later, not earlier. He looked at the numbers again. All right. That was all he said when a question remained open. Mira moved the surface feed forward 17 minutes. The figures were still on the breakwater. The containers were gone. In their place stood a 7th figure. Neither of them spoke for a while. The station vent above the rear cabinets gave a brief throat clear of air and settled back into its normal flow. Somewhere down the corridor, a service cart passed with the faint wheel rattle of loose bearings. The printer cooled with small internal ticks. Soren set both strips down in parallel. Could be nothing. It could. Could be an operator artifact. We're the only operators on this deck. He gave the corner of the desk a light tap with one knuckle, thinking, advance another 17. She did. The breakwater was empty. Again, he said. She advanced the feed. The tide had covered half the structure. No figures. No containers. Mira rested her elbow on the desk and touched one finger to her lip, not from nerves but habit. Soren had once counted how often she did that during live reviews and told her the number without expression. She had stopped for 3 weeks, then started again. They're building sequence around a fixed interval, she said. Or we're seeing a routine event and noticing it late. She zoomed back and let the settlement fill the screen. Lamps along the inner arc of the shore glowed in a narrow progression, one after another, like a hand moving across an unseen instrument. She had recorded that pattern many times. She knew the pause lengths. Tonight, the pause after the 12th lamp was shorter. Soren saw it too. He leaned one hand on the desk, close to the strips, but not touching them. Mark it. She tagged the sequence, entered the variants, and pushed the packet into the overnight comparison queue. Then she stopped before sending the usual note to Central Review. Soren noticed that as well. You don't want to log it yet. I want another pass first. Because if I write this now, the first answer back will be clock drift, the second will be observer bias, and by the time they get to the surface pattern, someone else will already have flattened it into a category. He straightened. It still needs to be logged. It will be when we can say what changed. He picked up the first strip again and read it, as if there might be text hidden between the printed maintenance blocks. You think the printer matters. I think it interrupted at the same interval we're seeing below. That doesn't make them linked. No, but you think they might be. Mira turned her chair a few degrees toward the glass. In the reflection, the room overlaid the planet. Her own face hovered faintly over the coastline, thin and pale from station light, almost erased by the screen data. I think, she said, we've spent 11 months assuming all the movement goes one way. Soren waited. From them to us, she said. Signal to observer. Pattern to analysis. Action to record. He glanced at the coast display again. And now? She did not answer that directly. Instead, she opened the long-range sensor hygiene logs and checked Array 3, where Soren had been working. No fault flags. No unauthorized output. No emissions beyond passive tolerance. She checked thermal bleed, lens polarization drift, packet echo, microlag. Clean. Better than clean. 2 even in places where random noise should have remained. Soren saw the line she was looking at. That's why I opened the floor. Because it's too perfect? Yes. She looked at him. He shrugged once, almost apologetic for saying aloud. Noise disappeared for 6 seconds at 1912. Systems don't become cleaner in the middle of a run. They get worse or stay the same. She called up the raw band. There it was. A section of observational noise reduced, not by adjustment, but by absence, as if the usual static had stepped aside. Not enough to trigger an alert. Enough to feel arranged. The settlement lamps on the lower feed completed another inner arc cycle. Mira opened the comparative frame stack and brought two nights side by side. Same shoreline. Same structures. Same tide depth with an acceptable deviation. But a cluster near the central rise had changed orientation. Not randomly. Deliberately. Small roof panels angled toward a point above the horizon line. Toward the station. She enlarged it until the image softened. Soren went back to the floor opening and pulled a fiber loop gently aside. How many structures? 12. Could be heat management. On the cold side at night? He did not answer. She checked the previous 3 nights. 10 structures. Then 9. Then 4. A progression. Slow enough to miss if you were focused on pathing and resource movement, which they had been. Another surface packet came in from the deep visual archive. Mira opened it. The breakwater figures appeared again, this time from a slightly different angle produced by orbital drift. 6 containers. 7 figures later. 1 figure taller than the others, or standing on a raised section. The image was too coarse to say more. On the desk, the 2 paper strips lay under the task light, the warm white beam making one edge look brighter than the other. Mira reached out and aligned them carefully. Their corners met exactly. She could feel Soren watching the gesture, not because it mattered, but because it was how she worked when she was nearing a line. "What did you think they were doing out there?" he asked. "Before tonight?" "Yes." Measuring tide response. Teaching a route. Maybe burial. And now? She touched the future timestamp with her nail. Maybe attendance. Soren stood still for a moment. Then he replaced the floor panel without fastening it. A temporary closure. Easy access if needed. He set the driver on the desk beside the strips and moved the screws into a tighter row. Mira opened the station's active concealment status. Nominal. Emission masking intact. Orbit signature blended against local debris mapping. To the monitored world below, Research Annex C should have been invisible unless they possessed tools or senses far beyond what the survey models allowed. That had been the comfortable assumption. Comfortable assumptions were the first thing Central Review protected. "Wake Central?" Soren asked. She looked at the time. 2 hours until formal relay window. Waking Central early meant handing the next decisions to people who had not spent 11 months looking at the coast, the lamps, the roof angles, the waiting figures. It meant summaries. Compression. Other people's language. "No," she said. He gave one nod. He was not agreeing. He was recording the decision. She pulled a blank page from the shelf drawer instead of opening a new digital file. Real paper, slightly rough, cut from station stores. She wrote the time by hand. Then the printer anomaly. Then array, 3 noise loss. Then roof orientation drift. Then the breakwater attendance count. Soren watched the page fill. "You only do that when you don't trust the system." "I trust the system," she said. He waited. "I don't trust the direction." The room went quiet again after that. Not empty. Working quiet. Mira kept one eye on the surface feed and one on the auxiliary sensor traces. Soren reopened the panel and began checking the fiber couplings one by one, his fingertips resting on each connector before he moved to the next, as if touch could tell him what the diagnostics had missed. Below them, along the dark edge of Ilya 9's coast, the settlement lamps began another sequence. This time the pause after the 12th lamp was longer. Mira wrote that down too. At 1929 station time, the printer started on its own. Not loud, just the small feed motor engaging, the dry pull of rollers, the thin advance of paper into light. Neither of them moved at first. A new calibration strip came out in a smooth, uninterrupted line and settled in the tray. Soren rose slowly from the floor. Mira reached over, lifted the strip, and read the timestamp. It was 17 minutes behind. She placed it on the desk beside the other 2, each strip parallel, edges almost touching. 3 narrow pieces of paper under one lamp. Past, present, future. On the surface feed, 7 figures stood on the breakwater again. Only now there were 8 containers. Soren did not touch the new strip right away. He stood beside the open floor panel with one hand hanging at his side, driver still in the other, and looked first at the paper, then at the surface feed, then at Mira. It was the order he used when he wanted to keep himself from choosing a conclusion too early. Mira laid the third strip in line with the first two. The latest one still held a little curl from the feed rollers. She flattened it with the side of her hand. Past, present, future. The time sat there without argument, neat black marks on white stock, as if the printer had only been doing office work. On the main screen, the 8 containers remained in 2 rows on the breakwater. 7 figures stood behind them, spaced so evenly that at a distance they looked placed rather than gathered. Mira enlarged the image until the shore grain broke apart into blocks. The containers were narrow and pale. No visible lids. No thermal signature strong enough to suggest engines or heat storage. The figures themselves showed the usual soft body warmth, less distinct than human profiles, their outlines blurred by atmosphere and range. Soren set the driver on the desk. We need a clock independent of station sync. We have 3. Independent, he repeated. She understood. Not a system check against another system on the same line. Something stupid and local. Something that did not care about station protocols. Mira opened the lower drawer and took out an old field timer the survey teams used during atmosphere workups. Mechanical backup. Wind-up spring. Analog face under a scratch cover. She turned the crown until resistance built, then set it beside the strips. The second hand began its small, steady sweep. Soren watched it for 2 full turns. Good. She marked the exact offset between the timer and station clock on the paper sheet. Then she slid the sheet half under the task light so the edge would not curl. Below them, a lamp on the inner shore went dark. Not burned out. Switched off. One clean point disappearing from the pattern. Then another. The breakwater figures did not move. Mira pulled up the wider settlement map. The darkening had started in the eastern band and was moving inward, a measured reduction, not failure. She checked weather overlay. No cloud interference. No grid instability. No tidal surge. Power rationing. Soren said. 2 symmetrical. The third lamp went out. Then the fourth. Each pause between them was almost equal. A countdown would have felt dramatic. This did not. It felt administrative. Soren leaned over the back of her chair, one knuckle against the frame, not touching her. Can they see more when they darken the coast? Depend what they're trying to see. She did not need to say the rest. Mira opened the station reflectivity model and entered the current atmospheric spread. A faint geometry appeared over the glass, projected sight lines, and speculative returns. Under normal coastal illumination, Annex C vanished into orbital clutter. With the shore darkened in deliberate sequence, a narrow corridor of contrast began to emerge. Not enough for certainty. Enough for an attempt. Soren straightened. They're not lighting the coast for themselves. No. He looked at the paper strips again. And the timing. Mira compared the analog timer to station time once more. No drift. No trick. Just seconds passing. The printer remained silent. She brought the archive nights back and ran a reverse scan on shore illumination over the past 10 weeks. At first, the pattern looked noisy because they had not been looking for this. Then the shape clarified. Certain lamps dimmed earlier on some nights. Certain arcs held longer. Dark corridors formed and dissolved with slight variations. Not random. Not practical either, if practical meant navigation or resource use. They've done this before, she said. How many times? Depends how strict you want to be. Strict. 9. Soren gave a short exhale through his nose. Loose. 23. He reached for the handwritten page. Not to take it, just to steady it while he read the notes upside down. And we missed it. We recorded it, she said. That's not the same. No, it wasn't. The station AI chimed softly with a routine status packet from Central Systems. Air recycling normal. External skin temperature nominal. Water reclamation 98.4 efficiency. The usual calm evidence that the machine world surrounding them continued unchanged. Mira muted the chime. On the lower feed, the shore darkening reached the central rise. The roof panels she had marked earlier reflected less and less as the lamps around them went out, until the whole cluster seemed to sink into the coastline. Only the breakwater remained lit by a line of low markers running along its outer edge. 8 containers. 7 figures. Soren moved to the side console and pulled up raw passive acoustic scatter from the coast. If there's staging, maybe there's movement under the image threshold. Mira nodded without looking away from the main screen. He adjusted filters manually instead of using the preset packages, one narrowband at a time. That was another habit Central Review disliked. Too slow, they said. Too personal. Hard to standardize. It was also why he found things. The acoustic field bloomed into layered bands of sea wash, wind friction, shell structure resonance, and the faint intermittent clicks of the coastal species moving across mineral surfaces. Soren isolated the breakwater zone and listened through the speakers at low volume. A scrape. Pause. 2 short contacts. Water under stone. Then nothing for several seconds. Again, same spacing. He adjusted the gain. The sound held. Mira said tool use. Or placement. Of the containers. Maybe. She turned the image a few degrees and checked for shadow shifts. One of the containers had moved less than its own width between frames. Not repositioned broadly. Turned, perhaps. Soren replayed the acoustic clip. Scrape. Pause. 2 contacts. Nothing. Same interval. Mira asked. He measured against station time, then against the analog timer she had written down. Close. Close isn't good enough. It's within 1.2 seconds. She wrote that down anyway. The station door remained open behind them, standard for an occupied workroom. After a moment, Soren crossed to it and closed it halfway. Not secrecy, fewer distractions. The latch did not catch unless forced, so the door stayed just ajar, enough to show a thin wedge of corridor light on the floor. Mira noticed because she noticed everything when tension became fine-grained. She went back to the archive. 9 previous nights under strict criteria. On 6 of them, there had been no breakwater gathering. On 2, there had been only containers. On 1, there had been figures and no containers at all. The sequences did not repeat exactly, but one constant remained. Each time the shore lamps created the contrast corridor, some fixed element on the coast aligned toward orbit. Roof panels, polished stone, water basins. Once, a stretch of tidal mesh angled between 3 support arches. Aiming was too strong a word for Central Review. She wrote it in the margin anyway. At 1934, the printer fed another strip. This time motion was shorter. A partial print, only 6 centimeters, then a clean stop. Soren crossed the room before it finished moving. He pulled the strip gently free, read the timestamp, and handed it to her without comment. 11 minutes ahead, not 17. Mira placed it apart from the first 3. A second set, perhaps, or a fracture in the pattern. She checked the analog timer. Still true. Not a fixed lead anymore, she said. Soren had already moved to the printer housing. Side panel off. Rollers exposed. He held one finger near the sensor eye, as if feeling for heat. No manual trigger. No cue. It shouldn't be able to do this without a request. Mira opened the internal command log. There was a request. Source. Local administrative process. Authorization chain. Valid. User stamp. None. She read it twice and called up the parent process. The trail ran backward through station housekeeping, then vanished into a maintenance layer that normally only handled self-tests during scheduled sleep cycles. Soren watched her face, not the screen. How bad? Bad enough to be tidy. He came around the desk. She moved aside so he could see. The command path sat there in neat gray lines, a clean bureaucratic lie. He looked at the analog timer. Can Central inject that layer? Not without leaving a better signature. Could the station do it by itself? That sentence covers too much ground. He accepted that. On the main feed, when the 7 figures finally moved, it stepped away from a line and approached the front row of containers, stopping before the one on the left. The others remained in place. The figure bent. Mira boosted contrast. From orbit, the motion was little more than an angle change. But after the figure straightened, the container's top edge looked different. Open, perhaps, or uncovered. Soren lowered himself into the chair at the side console, but he sat on its edge rather than fully down. Could they be displaying something reflective? Only if they know where to point it. He brought back the concealment model and overlaid the contrast corridor. They don't need a full position, just enough sky. Mira was already ahead of him, running a speculative line through the roof panel orientations, the breakwater marker lights, and the time darkening. The intersection cloud it produced was ugly and broad. Still, Annex C fell inside it more often than chance should allow. She did not say that aloud yet. Instead, she opened the oldest of their weekly summaries and reread the paragraph she had written in month 3. No evidence that the coastal species engage in directed observation above local atmospheric conditions. That sentence had been accurate when she wrote it. It sat now like a piece of furniture made for another room. Soren heard the soft sound of her closing the file. You wrote that one. Yes. He said nothing else. Below them, the bent figure returned to the line. 8 containers. 7 figures. Shore lamps nearly all dark except for the breakwater edge and 3 points farther inland forming a shallow triangle. Mira checked the triangle coordinates. The points matched an area the archive had flagged months ago as ceremonial due to recurring gatherings during tide shifts. Central Review had later downgraded it to probable resource sorting. Too little movement variety, they had said. Too much regular spacing. Regular spacing. She looked again at the figures on the breakwater, at the containers, at the time darkening, at the impossible printer strips laid under one lamp like evidence from 2 different worlds. What if we've mislabeled stillness, she said. Soren turned slightly toward her. Go on. We score activity by visible output. Construction, transport, tool changes, path deviation. We treat long pauses as low information states. He waited. What if the pause is the act? His gaze went back to the screen. That was as close as he came to agreement before testing a thought himself. The acoustic clip repeated through the speakers. Scrape. Pause. 2 contacts. Mira pulled the raw visual frames between the sounds. Nothing obvious changed. Then she slowed the playback to a level no one used in formal review because it took too long and made simple things look meaningful. The first scrape coincided with the bent figure's movement. The pause held. The 2 contacts matched 2 very small flashes from the container rim. Not light exactly, more like the brief loss of reflected sky. Lid hinges. Or shutters. Soren saw it. They're opening them on sequence. For what? He pointed at the concealment overlay. Maybe not for what. For when. Mira took that in. Then she lined up the printer strips by predicted time and checked the spread against the container actions below. 17 ahead. Present. 17 behind. 11 ahead. No clean pattern until she stopped looking at them as errors and started looking at them as windows. Not one clock slipping. Several moments sampled. She sat very still. Soren knew better than to interrupt when she went that quiet. The page under her hand had filled half its space. Notes in narrow columns. Time circled, crossed, circled again. She moved the analog timer an inch to the left so its tick would not fall directly under the task light. A meaningless adjustment, except it gave her eyes a new alignment. Then she saw it. The times on the printer strips did not center on now. They centered on the breakwater sequence. Not their present. Theirs. She stood up so quickly the chair rolled back a little and tapped the cabinet behind her. Not dramatic. Just force outrunning furniture. Soren was already on his feet. The printer isn't drifting across our clock, she said. It's bracketing their event. He looked from the strips to the coast. Explain. It prints before their change, at their change, after their change. Not relative to station operations. Relative to whatever they're doing down there. You're saying the admin layer is sinking to the surface? I'm saying something in the station is. Neither of them liked the sentence once it was in the room. The half-closed door shifted a fraction on its latch as corridor pressure changed. The wedge of light on the floor narrowed, widened, then settled again. Soren crossed to the main console and disabled all non-essential outbound processes from the observation deck. Routine telemetry only. No adaptive maintenance requests. No unsupervised housekeeping interactions. He worked fast, but each confirmation was deliberate. Mira did not stop him. On the surface feed, the figure at the front moved again. This time it lifted something from the open container. A flat object. Thin. Reflective enough to catch a line of the breakwater light and send it upward for less than a second. Straight at the sky. The printer started once more. Mira did not look away from the screen when she reached for the news strip. Her fingers found warm paper as it emerged. She pulled it free, read the timestamp, and placed it on the desk without smoothing it. Exactly on the second, the 3 inland lights went out. The entire coast disappeared. For a few seconds, there was nothing to look at. The surface feed turned into a flat, unbroken dark. No lamps, no edges, no reference points except the faint noise of ocean texture and the occasional scatter from cloud. The breakwater vanished into it completely. Mira didn't move her hand from the desk. The newest strip lay under her fingers, still slightly curved, the ink not fully cooled. She pressed it flat without thinking. Soren adjusted the gain on the visual feed. Then again, he pulled the spectrum toward the limits of what the sensor would tolerate before noise overwhelmed signal. Shapes began to return, not as light, but as absence. Thin edges where water met structure. A darker band where the breakwater cut into the sea. Hold there, Mira said. He held. The figures did not reappear. But the containers did. 8 pale slivers, barely distinguishable from the surface around them, but consistent across 3 consecutive frames. The line they formed was no longer straight. One had shifted forward by a small amount, enough to break the symmetry. Second from the left, Soren said. I see it. Mira marked the position. She did not look at the printer. Not yet. Soren switched to thermal. The readout came up dull. The sea held most of the residual heat. The breakwater barely registered. Then, one by one, narrow vertical signatures appeared where the containers stood. Not warm. Less cold. Like something was preventing them from matching the temperature of the stone beneath. Insulated, Soren said. Or active. He didn't argue. Mira leaned closer to the screen. Where are the figures? Soren didn't answer immediately. He layered motion detection over the low-light feed. It flagged nothing. Gone, he said at last. Gone how? Not moving. Not visible. Not heat-bearing. Under the breakwater? Possible. She checked structural scans from earlier weeks. The breakwater had no recorded internal cavities. Solid mineral foam with reinforcing roots. That doesn't mean it's empty, Soren added. No. The analog timer ticked steadily beside them. Mira checked it against the strip in her hand. This one was closer to present. Not before. Not after. Nearly aligned. The printer remained quiet. Sequence isn't finished, she said. Soren nodded once. They waited. Waiting had been most of their work for 11 months. But this was different. Before, they had waited for something to happen. Now, they were waiting for something to continue. Mira opened the acoustic feed again. At first, nothing. Then, a soft contact. Not scraped this time. A single tap. Hollow, faint. She replayed it. One tap. Then nothing for several seconds. Then another. Spacing, she asked. Soren measured. Not even. Deliberate. Could be. Mira slowed the playback again. Between the taps, there was something else. Not sound exactly. A gap in the background noise. A thinning where there should have been constant low-level movement. Like the earlier sensor silence. She wrote it down. On the visual feed, the container that had shifted forward moved again. Not sliding. Lifting, perhaps. The edge rose a fraction, then settled back. Soren switched to edge detection. The line sharpened just enough to confirm it. Opened, he said. Partially. The thermal signature of that container changed. Not warmer. Not colder. Just different. As if the interior had been exposed briefly to the air. Mira checked the timestamp on the strip again. Now. She placed it directly beside the analog timer. The second hands matched. Present window, she said. Soren did not look at her. Then the others are offsets. He finished it silently. Below them, another container opened. 2 now. The acoustic feed picked up a faint double contact. Not quite synchronized with the visual, but close enough to align within a margin they could not yet explain. Mira pulled up the earlier strips. 17 ahead. 17 behind. 11 ahead. Now, she arranged them not by order received, but by temporal relation to the container actions. A pattern began to emerge, not clean, not perfect, but structured. They're not random, she said. No, they're sampling. Soren turned his head slightly. Sampling what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she overlaid the concealment model again, but this time she adjusted it manually, ignoring the default atmospheric assumptions. She used the darkened coast as a variable instead of constant. The model shifted. The corridor of possible visibility narrowed. Not wide enough to guarantee detection, but narrow enough to aim. Soren saw it. They're creating a window, or a series of them. He stepped closer to the screen, and the containers are the mechanism. For what? Mira watched the second container close again. For timing. Soren considered that. They're marking intervals, or measuring response. To what? She didn't answer, because the question had turned. Not what they were doing, who they were doing it for. The printer engaged again. A short burst. Clean. No hesitation. Mira took the strip before it fully settled. 9 minutes behind. Not aligned with the previous offsets. She placed it with the others. The pattern fractured. No, she said quietly. Soren looked at her. That one doesn't fit. Check again. She did. Same result. Outlier or new phase. He didn't like either option. On the surface feed, a third container opened. Then a fourth. The sequence was accelerating. Not in speed, but in density. The gaps between actions were shrinking. The acoustic taps followed, irregular but increasing. Mira watched the analog timer. Seconds passed. Nothing matched cleanly anymore. The neat bracketing from before was gone. Soren moved to the system console and opened the station's internal process monitor. If something's sinking to the surface, it's not doing it cleanly, or we're only seeing part of it. He traced the administrative layer again. The same maintenance process. The same clean authorization. But now there were more entries. Small ones. Quick. Too fast for manual input. Frequency's up, he said. Mira didn't look. She was watching the containers. 5 open now. 6. The line was no longer orderly. Some edges higher than others. Some fully open, some barely. Not uniform, she said. Maybe they don't need to be. Or something changed. Soren glanced at the concealment model again. The corridor had shifted, not by much, but enough. They're adjusting, he said. To what? He didn't answer, because the answer was becoming obvious. Mira felt it before she said it. They're adjusting to us. The word sat there. No reaction, no movement, just a sentence that did not belong to their original model. Soren returned to the acoustic feed. The taps had become more frequent now, overlapping slightly, losing the earlier spacing. Sequences breaking, he said, or converging. Same difference. No. She pointed at the screen. The first container, the one that had shifted earlier, opened fully. Inside, something reflected. Not light. Not exactly. A distortion. A brief warping of the air above it, like heat shimmer, but colder, sharper. Soren leaned in. That's not thermal. No. Lens effect. Maybe. She increased magnification. The distortion held for less than a second, then vanished as the container closed again. But in that moment, the concealment model flickered. Not on the screen. In the system. Soren saw it. Did you? Yes. What was that? Something touched the model. He didn't ask how, because there was no clean answer. The station's concealment algorithms were not supposed to be interactive. They adjusted based on environment, not external input. Mira opened the raw model parameters. One value had changed. Barely. Within tolerance. But not generated by the system's own logic. Soren stared at it. That's not us. No. Central. No signature. He stepped back from the console. The room felt the same. Same air. Same light. But the direction of attention had shifted. Not from them to the surface. From the surface to them. Mira looked at the containers again. 7 now open. The sequence nearly complete. The 8th remained closed. Soren's voice was quieter. If they're sampling, they're refining. For what? She didn't answer. Because the last container began to move. Not opening. Turning. Slowly. Until its edge aligned. Not with the others. Not with the breakwater. With the sky. With a point above the horizon. A point that intersected. Exactly. With the station's position, the acoustic feed dropped to silence. Not absence. Suppression. The background noise thinned again like something had pressed it down. Mira felt her hand tighten on the edge of the desk. She did not notice until Soren reached over and gently moved her fingers away. No words, just a small correction. The container opened. Fully. Inside, the distortion returned. Stronger this time. Stable. Held. The concealment model on the console shifted again. More than before. Not enough to expose them. Enough to change the calculation. Soren exhaled slowly. They're not just looking. Mira nodded once. They're calibrating. The printer started again. Mira didn't reach for it immediately. She watched the distortion, watched the alignment, watched the model shift in response. Then she took the strip, read the timestamp, and this time, it didn't match any frame. Not past, not present, not future. It was blank. No time, just the grid. And at the bottom, where the timestamp should have been, a single line, not printed by the system, not part of any diagnostic format. Just a mark. Short, precise, like a signal. The mark on the strip was not centered. It sat low, slightly to the right, as if placed without concern for the grid it interrupted. Mira held the paper under the task light and tilted it once. The ink did not catch differently. No hidden layering. No bleed. Soren watched her angle the strip. Repeatable. Not yet. She placed it apart from the others, leaving a narrow gap between that one and the rest, then drew a small square around it on the handwritten page. No label. Just a box. The distortion on the surface feed held for 2 more seconds and then collapsed without fading. The container closed. The breakwater returned to a line of dull edges in the low-light model. The acoustic suppression lifted. Sea noise came back first, then the thin, irregular clicks of movement across the shore. Soren turned down the gain. Whatever that was, it ended clean, or we lost it. He accepted the ambiguity. Mira looked at the concealment model again. The parameters had settled, but not to their original values. The difference was small. It would pass any routine check. It would not have been noticed if they were not already watching for it. She wrote the new value next to the old one. Soren moved to the system console and isolated the model layer. I'm going to lock this. Do it local, she said. No propagation. He nodded. Local only. His fingers moved across the controls, not quickly, not slow. He disabled external adjustment permissions for that layer and set a manual override key to the DEX access codes. When he finished, he did not say anything. He just looked at her. She understood. The system would now resist change. Not impossible to alter, but no longer fluid. Below them, the breakwater remained dark. The containers were closed again. No figures visible. Mira pulled back the view and checked the wider coast. The lamps had not come back. The inland triangle remained dark. The shoreline held its shape only through residual scatter. End of sequence. Soren asked. Maybe. Or interval. She didn't disagree. The analog timer ticked on. Mira checked it against the station clock again. Still aligned. She picked up the strip with the mark and held it next to the one from the present window. The grids matched. The density matched. Only the absence of time and the presence of that single line separated them. Angle? Soren asked. Not a straight print artifact, she said. He took the strip from her and held it at arm's length. Then closer. He rotated it 90 degrees, then 180. The mark remained aligned, not resolving into a shape with orientation. Could be a glyph, he said. From what set? He didn't answer. Mira set the strip back down. She opened a new layer on the main console and drew the mark digitally, matching length and position relative to the grid. Then she overlaid it onto the concealment model coordinates, scaling until the proportions aligned. Nothing obvious. She shifted the overlay. Still nothing. Soren watched her try 3 more alignments, each based on a different assumption about origin and orientation. None held. Try the surface, he said. She did. The mark, scaled to the breakwater frame, cut across nothing meaningful. Not the containers. Not the inland triangle. Not the roof panels. She paused. Then she rotated the overlay 90 degrees. The line now intersected. The point where the container had aligned. The point of distortion. Not perfectly. Close. Soren saw it. Reference. Correction. For what? She didn't answer. Because the question had changed again. Not what they were doing. Not how. Why that mark? Mira cleared the overlay and brought up the full sequence of container actions. 8 containers. 7 figures. 1 distortion event. She plotted the timing of each opening and closing against the strips. The earlier pattern, bracketing, held for the first phase. Then the intervals tightened. Then the outlier strip. Then the present. Then the blank. Phases, she said. Soren leaned on the console. Define them. Initial sampling. Adjustment. Convergence. And the mark? She looked at the strip again. Transition. He nodded once. They stood there for a moment, both looking at the same set of data, both seeing the same structure, neither pushing it further yet. The room remained steady. The half-closed door held its narrow line of corridor light. The air vent above the cabinets gave a brief shift and returned to its normal flow. Small systems continuing their work. Mira reached for the kettle without thinking, then stopped halfway and set it back down. No reason to heat water. No one would drink it. Soren noticed the aborted motion. He did not comment. He moved instead to the floor panel again and reseated it properly this time, fastening each screw with the same measured turns as before. Not because the panel needed it now, because unfinished things distracted him. When he finished, he placed the driver back on the desk, parallel to the paper strips. Mira checked the system logs again. The administrative layer still showed activity. Faster now. Short commands. Rapid succession. No user stamp. No external signature. Frequency increased, she said. Still clean. Too clean. Soren exhaled slowly. It's not noise. No. He looked at the printer. It sat idle. Quiet. Waiting. Mira did not like that. She opened the command log for the printer specifically. The last entry matched the blank strip. Source. Same administrative process. Authorization. Valid. User none. She traced the process again. This time, instead of stopping at the maintenance layer, she forced a deeper inspection, bypassing the usual abstraction. The path extended further. Not cleanly. Fragments. Incomplete references. Like something had been built on top of the maintenance layer, not replacing it, but using it. Soren leaned closer. That's new. It wasn't there before. Or we didn't see it. She scrolled. The fragments resolved into small routines. Simple. Repetitive. Each one tied to a timestamp. Not station time. Offset time. Relative to the surface sequence. Soren straightened. It's mirroring them. Or following. Which came first? She didn't answer. Because that question no longer had a clear direction. Below them, the coast remained dark. But the breakwater, a faint line appeared. Not light. Reflection. The containers were no longer visible. The line was smooth. Continuous. As if the surface had been cleared. Mira increased gain again. The line sharpened. No containers. No figures. Just the breakwater. Empty. Soren checked thermal. Nothing. Acoustic. Only C. Reset, he said. Or completion. Mira checked the analog timer. 5 minutes had passed since the last distortion. No new strips. No new surface changes. The system logs continued their rapid, quiet activity. She looked at the handwritten page. Times. Offsets. Phases. The boxed mark. She added one more line. Post-phase. Unknown. Soren read it upside down. Temporary, he said. Everything is. He nodded. They stood in silence again. Not waiting now. Holding. Mira moved the strips slightly, aligning them more precisely. Past. Present. Future. Outlier. Blank. A sequence that no longer fit into a simple line. Soren watched her adjust them. You're treating them like data points, he said. They are. No. She looked up. They're messages. She didn't react immediately. Because the word carried weight. Too much, if used too early. But the structure, the timing, the alignment, the mark. She looked back at the strips. At the blank one. At the line. Then at the surface feed. Empty breakwater. Dark coast. No visible activity. But the system. Still moving. Still adjusting. Still responding. She exhaled slowly. If it's a message, she said, it's not for us. Soren didn't argue, because that felt true. Not for them. For something else. Something the station represented. Or something beyond it. The printer engaged again. Soft. Controlled. A new strip began to feed. Mira didn't reach for it immediately. She watched it come out. Full length this time. No interruption. No hesitation. When it finished, she took it. Read it. A timestamp. Valid. Aligned. Station time. Now. No mark. No anomaly. Just a clean diagnostic print. She placed it with the others. Soren looked at it. Back to normal? Or pretending? He nodded. The system log slowed. Not stopped. Reduced. The concealment model held steady. No further shifts. The surface remained dark. No return of lamps. No movement. Mira looked at the strip again. Clean. Ordinary. After everything. She didn't like that either. She wrote one more line on the page. Normal state, unreliable. Soren read it. Didn't comment. He moved to the door and opened it fully. The corridor light widened across the floor. A small change, but deliberate. Mira watched the light shift, then looked back at the screen. Nothing had changed. And that was the problem. The corridor light made a longer line across the floor now, reaching almost to the base of the consoles. Mira noticed how it cut just short of the paper strips. A narrow margin of shadow remained between the edge of the light and the first strip in the row. She shifted the stack half a centimeter forward so the light touched the corner of the blank one. No reason, just alignment. Soren stood by the open door for a moment, looking out into the corridor as if expecting someone to pass. No one did. The station ran on cycles that rarely overlapped human movement. Most of the deck would be empty for hours. He stepped back inside and left the door open. Mira glanced at the surface feed again. Still nothing. No lamps returning. No figures. No containers. Only the coast, defined by absence. She adjusted the gain down slightly. Then back up. The noise pattern remained consistent. Too quiet, she said. Soren returned to the console. You want noise? I want the kind that doesn't choose when to disappear. He nodded. He pulled up the long-range scatter again and ran a variance check across the last 20 minutes. The earlier suppression events stood out clearly now that he had a baseline. Clean troughs in the noise field, each one aligned with container activity. He overlaid the timestamps from the strips. Even the outlier, even the blank, they all sat within the troughs. Correlation holds, he said. Across phases? Yes. Mira wrote that down. Then she paused. The page was nearly full. Not crowded, just complete. She turned it over and started a new one. Soren watched the motion. You're not sending anything yet. Not yet. He didn't push. Instead, he opened the station's external signature monitor. If they're narrowing their window, we should see some effect here. Mira leaned over. The monitor displayed the station's projected visibility against various models. Normally a smooth, stable field. Now, there were slight fluctuations. Small dips and rises. Not enough to break concealment, but enough to show interaction. They're not just aiming, Soren said. They're adjusting for feedback. Mira nodded slowly. From us, she said. From the station. Same thing. He didn't correct her, because in this context it was... Mira looked back at the paper strips. 5 of them now in a row, each representing a different relation to the surface sequence. She picked up the blank one again. The mark still sat there, unchanged. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She held it closer to the light. No pressure marks. No hidden impression. Just the line. Soren watched her. You're treating it like language. I'm treating it like intent. Difference. Language assumes shared structure. And intent doesn't care if we understand it. He considered that, then nodded once. Mira set the strip down again. She opened the visual archive and began pulling frames from the previous nights, the ones that matched the strict criteria for corridor formation. 9 nights, 9 sequences. She aligned them side by side. At first, they looked different. Different numbers of containers, different figure counts, different lamp patterns. But when she stripped away the visible variations and focused only on the timing of changes, a pattern emerged. Not identical, but converging. Soren saw it too. They've been refining this. Yes. For how long? Longer than we've been here. He exhaled quietly. That means They didn't start because of us. He nodded. But they changed because of us. She didn't argue. Because the evidence was there. The earlier sequences were broader, less precise, more variation. The recent one, tighter, cleaner, focused. Mira leaned back slightly, not away from the console, just enough to change her angle. They're not discovering us, she said. They're narrowing. On what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the concealment model again. The locked parameters held, but the external inputs, the adjustments, they were still being calculated, even without permission. On the edge, she said. Soren looked at her. They don't need to see us, she continued. They need to find a boundary between visible and not. Yes. He turned back to the screen. That's efficient. It is. They stood there for a moment. Not impressed. Not afraid. Just recognizing the structure. Mira checked the system logs again. The activity had slowed further. Now it came in short bursts. Then pauses. Then bursts again. Not continuous. Discrete. She compared the timing to the surface archive. The bursts aligned, not with the container actions, but with the gaps between them. They're not just reacting, she said. They're pacing. Soren nodded. Call, in response. She didn't like the phrasing, but it fit. Mira wrote it down anyway, then crossed it out, then wrote. Alternating control. Soren read it. That's better. Below them, the coast remained unchanged. Dark. Still. But the absence now felt structured, not empty. Mira adjusted the visual feed again. This time, instead of increasing gain, she reduced it, letting the noise swallow the faint edges. The breakwater disappeared. The coast flattened. Only the ocean remained visible. Soren glanced at her. Why? If they're working at the boundary, we should look at the boundary. He didn't argue. She overlaid the concealment model onto the reduced feed. The boundary became visible, not as a line, as a gradient, a soft transition between detectable and undetectable, normally ignored. Now, important. Soren leaned closer. Can they see that? Not directly, but they can find it. Yes. How precise? She didn't answer, because the answer was on the screen. The gradient had shifted, not by much, but enough. Soren saw it. They're pushing it, or measuring its response. He nodded. Mira felt a small tightening in her chest. Not fear, recognition. This wasn't observation anymore. Not in the way they had defined it. She looked at the strips again, at the sequence, at the blank, at the mark, then at the system logs, at the bursts, at the pauses. They're not just studying us, she said. Soren didn't look away from the screen. No, he said. They're studying the system we're part of. Mira nodded once. And the system is responding. He didn't argue. Because it was. The printer remained quiet. The logs slowed further. The gradient held. The coast stayed dark. Everything stabilized. Mira didn't trust it. She never trusted stability that followed rapid change. She reached for the analog timer again. Checked it. Still aligned. She wrote the current time. Then added. No activity sustained. Soren read it. Temporary. Everything is. He almost smiled. Almost. The room settled into a new kind of quiet. Not waiting. Not holding. Observing. But differently. Mira moved the strips again. This time not aligning them. Spacing them. Equal distance between each. A sequence. Not linear, but structured. Soren watched. You're mapping them. Yes. To what? She didn't answer. Because she didn't know yet. But the instinct was there. The need to place them not in time, but in relation. The corridor light on the floor shifted slightly as the station adjusted its internal cycle. The edge of the light moved across the strips, touching one, then another, then the blank. Mira watched it, then looked back at the screen. Still nothing. She exhaled slowly. We missed the first message, she said. Soren didn't respond immediately. Then, or we're still inside it. Mira looked at him. That felt more accurate. Not a sequence of events. A continuous one. She turned back to the console. Opened a new log. Not for Central. For them. She wrote. We are within the interval. Soren read it. Didn't correct it. Didn't question it. He just moved to the console beside her and began adjusting the passive sensors again. Not searching. Refining. Mira watched the gradient. The boundary. The edge. waiting for the next shift, not knowing if it would come, or if it already had. A thin strand of cable near the base of the console tightened and then eased again. Mira noticed it because it didn't follow the usual pattern of the station's internal cycles. The tension shift was small, barely enough to change the curve where the cable met the panel, but it happened once, paused, then repeated with a slightly different timing. She rested 2 fingers lightly against the casing beside it. No vibration, no heat change, just a faint visual memory of movement. Soren saw where her hand had gone. Structural? Too localized. He crouched and traced the cable back to its junction point. Load balancing, maybe. Then it would be consistent. He watched the cable for a few seconds. It didn't move again. He stood. Mira didn't remove her hand immediately. Then she did, and returned her attention to the main console. The surface feed remained reduced. The boundary gradient still held. The concealment model showed no new shifts. The system logs had slowed to near idle. Everything appeared stable. Again, Mira looked at the analog timer, then at the strips, then at the blank one. The mark hadn't changed. It wouldn't. She knew that. Still, she checked. Soren moved to the system console and pulled up a long-range projection of the station's orbit relative to the coastline. "We're drifting," he said. "Expected. Not like this." Mira leaned in. The projection showed their orbital path, a smooth arc adjusted continuously by minor corrections. But now, there was a slight deviation. Not enough to alter trajectory, but enough to change angle, relative to the surface. "Adjustment request?" she asked. "None logged. External? No signature." Mira stared at the projection. The deviation aligned, not with the station's operational needs, with the breakwater, with the corridor, with the point of distortion. "They're not just measuring," she said. Soren nodded. "They're influencing." The words sat heavier than the others. Not dramatic, just precise. Mira checked the concealment model again. The locked parameters held. But the boundary, it had shifted again. Not pushed, pulled, toward alignment. Soren stepped back slightly. "Feedback loop," he said. "Yes." "From both sides." Mira nodded once. She reached for the handwritten page. Turned it over. Wrote. "Bidirectional." Soren read it. Didn't comment. He moved to the printer. Ran a manual diagnostic. The machine responded normally. No anomalies. No unexpected commands. Clean. He stepped back. "Quiet," he said. Too quiet. Mira glanced at the system logs again. Minimal activity. No bursts. No irregularities. If she had looked at this without context, she would have logged it as stable. Normal. She didn't write that. Instead, she wrote, "Silence is active." Soren read it. This time, he nodded slightly. Below them, the coast remained unchanged. No lights. No movement. But the absence. It no longer felt like inactivity. Mira adjusted the visual feed again. Not gain. Not spectrum. Angle. She shifted the observation vector slightly, within allowable limits. The boundary gradient responded. Not by moving. By sharpening. Soren saw it. "They're still there," he said. "Yes. Just not visible. Not in the way we expect." He watched the gradient. Then the orbit projection. Then back to the strips. "Everything lines up," he said. Mira followed his gaze. The strips. The times. The phases. The blank. The mark. The orbit deviation. The boundary shift. All separate elements. All connected. Not by sequence. By relation. She felt the structure settle into place. Not complete, but coherent. "They're not sending messages," she said. Soren looked at her. "They're building a model. Of us. Of the system." He nodded slowly. "And we're part of it." "Yes." Mira looked at the blank strip again. The mark. Simple. Precise. She picked it up. Held it next to the boundary gradient on the screen. Not aligning it. Just comparing. The length of the line. The proportion. The placement. Then she lowered it. "They marked a transition," she said. "Between what?" She didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was not clean. Not a boundary between visible and invisible. Not between known and unknown. Something else. She looked at the orbit projection again. At the deviation. At the alignment with the breakwater. Then back at the gradient. At the subtle shift. "They marked when the system started to respond," she said. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then, that includes us. Yes. He exhaled slowly. No tension, just acknowledgement. Mira set the strip down, carefully, in line with the others, but not touching. She adjusted the spacing once more. Equal. Measured. Soren watched. You're finalizing it. Yes. For what? She didn't answer. Because there was no report to send. Not yet. Maybe not at all. She turned back to the console. Opened a new layer. Not for analysis. For observation. Clean. Empty. No assumptions. No categories. Just data. Soren moved beside her. Not speaking. Not asking. Just present. The corridor light shifted again as the station cycle advanced. This time, it reached fully across the strips. No shadow gap. All of them equally lit. Mira noticed. She didn't move them. Below, the coast remained dark. The boundary held. The orbit drift stabilized. The system logs quieted further. Everything. Balanced. Not static. Stable. Soren glanced at the printer one more time. Still idle. He didn't approach it. Mira checked the analog timer. Then stopped checking. No need. Time was no longer the primary reference. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the desk. Not gripping. Not tense. Just contact. Soren leaned back slightly, shifting his weight. The room held. No new signals. No new anomalies. No resolution. Mira looked at the surface feed one last time. At the empty breakwater. At the dark coast. Then at the boundary gradient. At the subtle, continuous line between detectable and not. She didn't try to define it. Didn't try to measure it. Just observed. After a while, she reached over and turned off the task light. The strips remained visible in the softer ambient glow. Less precise. Still present. Soren didn't comment. He moved to the door and left it open. The corridor light blended with the room. No sharp edges. Mira didn't write anything more. Didn't adjust the model. Didn't send a report. She sat, watching, not waiting, not concluding, just inside the interval, and holding it,